individually, or turn your microphones back on when you're ready.
When the U.S. government imports and exports defense articles, these activities carry with them a set of regulations. This regulation is International Traffic in Arms Regulation. It's also known as ITAR. ITAR ensures national security interests are protected in the United States and transferring arms. Activities that are governed is the transfer of defense articles, the sale of defense articles, and the provision of training on these defense articles. The output from this is ultimately global security, which is why the U.S. cares about it so dearly. Assistance takes two forms. Security assistance is the funding to employ, equip, and generate assistance to partners in promoting regional stability. And security cooperation is building defense capability through training on these platforms that are provided by the U.S. ITAR ultimately determines how and where the Department of State can fulfill on security assistance promises. Section 123.4 deals with temporary import licensure, and 126.4 shipments by for U.S. agencies. And these are pretty restrictive. The restrictive nature of them lends to produce a narrow field of vendors that the Department of State can actually deal with. And this narrow field lends itself to the creation of monopolies. And these monopolies highlight the importance of supply relationship management. Barriers defense incorporated industry or vendor faces is proving U.S. origin of parts, and also retaining greater control over their 3PL, which in this case is Sikorsky, because we're dealing with helicopters. Defense Industry Incorporated is currently contracted to upgrade 23 drivetrains on the 23 CH-53 Stallions that the Vietnamese Coast Guard owns. This is a promise that was made from the United States Embassy in Hanoi to the Vietnamese Coast Guard and ultimately to the government of Vietnam. The goal here of the United States was to improve the government of Vietnam's search and rescue capacity within the South China Sea region, and this was in reaction to microaggressions from China in the region. For each drivetrain, Defense Industries Incorporated must produce a manufacturer's affidavit that certifies that the part is made in America and that the training that is provided is given wholly by Americans. And the only reason that they care about this is to ensure that we can avoid the tariffs that otherwise occur. The consequence of fewer manufacturing affidavits is more tariffs, and more tariffs lend themselves to a larger maintenance cost, all of which is passed along to the consumer, in this case, the government of Vietnam. Failure here could ultimately result in souring prospects of the government of Vietnam buying U.S. platforms. It would be too easy for them to run to Russia or China to buy like models, which are cheaper. So this makes artful management of supply relationship management absolutely essential, because the interaction between Defense Industries Incorporated and the government of Vietnam defines America's brand, for better or worse.
Great. So Jason opened up the issue in a great way, which is to realize that, you know, DII, we're this private company and we're providing a service, right? A service that the government's contracting us to do that is augmenting some portion of what they themselves would normally do, or in the case that Jason mentioned, this is a modernization program, and these are quite common with, you know, U.S. allies across the world, that we do modernization programs for usually non-NATO members. So let's take Vietnam, for instance. We have this contract to fulfill with these helicopters. Part of our total training packages, you know, we're doing combat training, but we're also doing logistics training. We're acting as a 3PL. We have a logistics facility in the United States. It's our hub for being the importer and exporter of record. And in this case, SRM is really important because with Sikorsky, they don't necessarily offer training, but with Boeing and companies like Lockheed and Raytheon, they might offer some of the same functions and training that you do as a private company. as a private defense firm, right? So the particular case here of manufacturing affidavits is that Sikorsky wants to give up as little information as possible, but in order for our client, which is the government of Vietnam, and which is really their client also at the same time, it turns into an adversarial relationship that it shouldn't be. So the best way forward for implementing supplier relationship management is, number one, is the FSR, the field service representative, is basically the face of that company, usually the technical expert on whatever system we're talking about. So on these specific Seahawk drivetrains, we likely have an FSR right now working, who I can go to at any time about compliance issues or our timeline. So that's really the first point of contact, and we want to try to strengthen that relationship. So we build a team at the top, that reports directly to either the CEO or the COO. We build a team at the top, and then we engage with the program manager for Sikorsky in the United States. So for every program around the world that's doing a maintenance or a modernization program, an upgrade program, usually there's a program manager based in the United States for that company. So if we can get a lot of buy-in from the FSR, the program manager, some other people at Sikorsky, and the government of Vietnam, as well as the Office of the Program Manager for the U.S. Army, who usually administers these contracts on behalf of the government when they're contracted to do so, when we can get all those aligned and show that there is a benefit to everyone, and these costs, to talk about the impact of manufacturing affidavits, this is essentially money that they shouldn't have to pay. They bought a defense article from the United States, in this case, an entire aircraft. And whenever a part comes off of that, as far as the government is concerned, that part is an American part. But you need a manufacturing affidavit for each individual part that states that it's made in America, right? Because it's, we mentioned it's not always stamped on there. If it's not stamped on the part, if it has no indication, the manufacturing affidavit must come with it. And the typical cost, for instance, if we were to send one rotor blade back or a turbine fan, hovers between $800 and $1,200 per item. Obviously, that's not rising to the cost of the item, but that is contributing significantly. That's usually going to be well more than what the shipping is of a rotor blade, because we're going to do that by ocean freight. So automatically, any savings you had, if you got a good deal on your logistics side, if you were using a new carrier and making more money, would be wiped out immediately with these tariffs. And those costs add up year after year. In my own experience in another company at one point, sometimes those costs can get up to about $200,000 or $300,000 a year. And then you can see what a problem it becomes and why implementing supplier relationship management with the people that I mentioned is so important.
So as Jason and Ryan discussed, there are many strengths and weaknesses, opportunities, and threats that are visible through any SWOT analysis. For supplier relation management, the reason why that we want to do it is because, as mentioned before, it lets us see when there are possible dangers to the supply chain. The suppliers and customers, well, are more willing to work through tough situations, like what happens if there's delays, what happens if there's an unexpected change in tariffs coming in or out of the United States. These kinds of issues are always dealt with better if you have a good relationship with the company. They're more willing to work with you. They're more, and then on top of that, it's kind of a double-edged sword, which is that in a lot of countries, Asia specifically, contracts don't have as much of legal weight as they do in particular, like in the United States. So in those areas of the world, your relationship, your handshake, your word carries way more weight in it, and you have to build these relationships if you want to be able to do business. So it's SRM is a definite strength to any business enterprise. One of the weaknesses is that internally you have to apply the resources from it, and those resources are oftentimes they come at the as an expense, a cost that you wouldn't necessarily always apply. But this is one of those cases where you need to apply it because the strengths the strengths definitely outweigh the weaknesses in this particular case. When it comes to opportunities, when you have the relationship, it does provide some cost savings. Even though you have the cost increase of having to have the personnel, your field managers and your project managers and stuff like that, where it does create cost savings is companies are more willing to cut prices, give discounts, sometimes purchase more when you've been a trustworthy, supply chain, advisor. And as Ryan said, a lot of times you're dual hatting as the 3PL, and that's what if you can successfully navigate tariffs and treaties, sometimes they're like, hey, we don't just need these rotors. How about you get us some, I don't know, Rubbermaid ice coolers, non-defense industry things, because you know how to get around those tariffs and treaties that, just a month ago didn't exist, but you know how to get around them. So they call up their field buddy their buddy that knows how to get around these rules. Now the threats to building up a good supplier relations management is one of the key ones is that companies can take advantage of it. They'll hire away your best reps. They will use it to cut their costs. Oftentimes, a customer in one situation is a supplier in another situation and a competitor in a third situation. For DII, Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, those are all peers and near peer and their competitors. So you have to watch out for the relation. You have to maintain your relationships with them, because it makes business sense, but you can't let it get too close. Another thing that's happening that's you see in the news a lot lately is that because so many businesses, corporations are so often the face of American politics, you get a guilt by association that happens sometimes. A great example right now is Blackwater made some very, very unethical choices, and it tarnished the view of Americans outside the United States. And with the geopolitical environment always changing the way it does, sometimes those kind of changes from other companies, from other politicians, from outside forces, they can change the profitability of a contract of a contract or a deal that you've already put in place. And then again, as we've seen, just recently in the last few months, tariffs and treaties that have been in place for a while can suddenly just evaporate and go away, or pop up out of the middle of nowhere. And that's again a good reason why, because the only way to deal with that threat is to the only way to deal with the threat to your supplier relationships is to try and work through it, as with the relationship of your suppliers and your customers.
All right, so thanks, Charles, and as well as Jason and Ryan for getting us through to this point. I'm looking at how SRM, supplier relationship management best practices, will serve to reduce the implementation timeline and help defense industries reduce their tariff costs in several ways. So looking at it, we feel that joint investment and innovation efforts represent a hallmark of achievement in SRM, and this is when two organizations really connect and engage deeply together. Improvement actions may initially be focused on more operational areas in the early days of the relationship, but over time, they move to new areas of collaboration and investments identified at the relationship level and sponsors at the top level of the relationship pyramid. So by setting up a dedicated team with Sikorsky, defense industries will have the opportunity to quickly begin to build trust. This will allow defense industries to gain a deep level of understanding of how Sikorsky operates and how best to work together. One of the biggest keys to making this work is to become closely aligned with Sikorsky's program managers for Vietnam exports. By establishing how defense industries can provide their superior quality parts in a cheaper and timelier fashion with the assistance of Sikorsky, by them providing manufacturing affidavits, is a win-win situation that can clearly be shown. Some strong arguments that leaders use in favor of supplier relationship management include you avoid benefits leak past the contracting stage, for example, seeing the agreement through. Risk independence on critical suppliers justifies resources and ongoing commitment. There are many things you cannot put into contracts, such as premium access to supplier resources and innovations, and increased credibility and reliability as a customer of choice with suppliers. So we think that a lot of those points can be critical in helping expedite supplier relationship management in the timeline of implementation.
All right, thank you, Peter. Coming into our final recommendation, a couple of points that I want to reach back and touch on is that in a monopolistic environment, which is created because of the narrow field of qualified vendors who can provide products and services to a company or a government in this case, it can lead to set ways of doing things. So the cutting edge understanding of what benefits all parties involved and how to better work together for those benefits can take a while to trickle in or to take effect in these companies that are so set in their ways. So part of what Peter had talked about in the effectiveness of the supply chain relationship management team and speeding up that timeline is actually through a part of supply chain relationship management that's called customer relationship management. So what's going to happen in the customer relationship management is they have to deal with the export program managers. They have to deal with the field service representatives for Vietnam, everyone that they can get in contact with to, as Ryan put it, get that buy-in that's necessary for the change. And to get that buy-in in a more expedited fashion. So the way to do that is through relationships. Trying to go through the proper channels, trying to go through the bureaucracy of it can take a considerable amount of time. So with that in mind, part of the way that we would be implementing that is to take the ideas of power dependency. In this case, the monopoly, Sikorsky, is the power. The dependency is the Vietnamese government. And we would have to take the conflict out of it, take that desire for secrecy or preventing their MAs from being readily available, and turn that into a transparent process that will allow for Vietnam to save money on tariffs, to take advantage of other opportunities to source from Sikorsky or from DII, in the way of, as Charles put it, getting non-defense contracting items such as Rubbermaid coolers. So with that, we would have to go into the quasi-cooperation exchange idea, where it's not about the conflict; it's about the cooperation, about the synergy within the companies. And by way of that, we would have to go ahead and set up that supply relationship team. We would have to move forward with the buy-in, and we would have to make sure we're protecting our interests, mitigating threats of customers going elsewhere due to extra costs, promote U.S. origin equipment, maintain our foreign policy, and protect the end use of that equipment, which is very important to not only DII in sourcing that equipment, but also to Sikorsky in manufacturing it. Thank you very much.